Despite flying into the sunset nearly a quarter century ago, Lockheed's legendary SR-71 Blackbird was so far ahead of its time that even today, some 59 years since its first flight, there has yet to be a single aircraft to challenge its position atop the podium of fastest manned jets in history. Over its 3-decade career, the Blackbird famously had more than 4,000 missiles fired at it, and it managed to outrun every single one of them. But no aircraft is invincible, and the Blackbird was no exception. With looming concerns about high-speed Soviet fighters closing the capability gap, not to mention the need to train your fighter pilots against all sorts of threats, the US Air Force decided to pit their Mach 3 reconnaissance plane against the best fighters America had to offer, both of which would go on to become legends in their own right: the US Navy's F-14 Tomcat and the US Air Force's F-15 Eagle. Let's find out what it took to bring down the Blackbird, not to mention which of these two flying powerhouses had the better shot. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power.
Mach 1.
The SR-71 Blackbird was designed to defeat the most capable air defense systems and intercept fighters that the planet had ever seen, all through a combination of early stealth and electronic warfare technologies, meticulous mission planning, and maybe most important of all, sheer power. The SR-71 can really be seen as maybe the most successful design of famed aeronautical engineering deity Kelly Johnson. Johnson had already proven his designing mettle with projects like World War II's P-38 Lightning and America's first jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star, and most notably to that point, the high-flying U-2 spy plane. In fact, it was Johnson's efforts during the U-2 program that led to the establishment of the secretive military facility many of us now know as Area 51. But as groundbreaking as all of these previous efforts were, the Archangel program and the SR-71 it produced were really in a league of their own. While the SR-71's disclosed top speed of Mach 3.2 tends to get the lion's share of attention, the truth is it wasn't just reaching that speed that made the Blackbird such an incredible platform. After all, aircraft like the rocket-powered North American X-15 went significantly faster, Mach 6.7 later that same decade. But while the X-15 could cover maybe 240 miles per flight and needed a complete engine rebuild after every 1 hour of operation, the SR-71 was designed to fly faster than a speeding bullet for hours and hours on end before landing safely on an airstrip to be refueled for another flight the following day. I'll quote the man himself, Kelly Johnson, now. The idea of attaining and staying at Mach 3.2 over long flights was the toughest job the Skunk Works ever had, and the most difficult of my career. Early in the development stage, I promised $50 to anyone who could find anything easy to do. I might as well have offered $1,000 because I still have the money. The Blackbird's ability to sustain Mach 3 speeds for so long created massive engineering hurdles, like the need to invent new kinds of wire for the avionics systems that could survive huge temperature fluctuations, and the need to specially formulate hydraulic fluids that would work at ground level and 16 miles above the Earth. In order to meet both weight and temperature requirements, the decision was made to use titanium for 93% of the aircraft's structure. But the only place in the world where you could get that much titanium was from the Soviet Union. So the CIA established a series of shell companies to secretly buy titanium that would be used to spy on the Soviets from the Soviets. Even the windshield posed unique problems, as the extreme temperatures of sustained Mach 3 flight would make glass translucent instead of transparent, obscuring the pilot's view. Instead, the SR-71's windows had to be made out of solid 1¼ inch thick pieces of quartz that were sonically fused to the airframe. And even then, the quartz windows would get so hot during flights that crews could hold their rations just a few inches from the glass to rapidly heat them up before in-flight meals. Now, the SR-71 wasn't technically speaking a stealth aircraft, in that it wasn't designed with stealth as a priority right from the onset, but Johnson did incorporate a number of stealth design elements, thanks in no small part to competition with Convair's Kingfish, and these included things like early radar absorbent coatings, and as a result, the SR-71's radar cross-section has been estimated to be a range between as small as 0.1 square meters, or maybe as large as a Cessna 172. Either way, for a 107-foot-long spy plane, that's not so bad. Now, it was actually this combination of speed and stealth that made the SR-71, or the Habu as so many pilots knew it, so difficult to target. Basically, because its radar cross-section was so small, by the time surface-to-air missile systems identified it in the air, it was already right above them. So even if they were to launch a missile that had a closing rate that was faster than the SR-71's top speed, it was already out of range by the time the missile could reach its altitude. And the story wasn't much better for high-performance intercept fighters like the Soviet MiG-25, which could theoretically reach speeds as high as Mach 3.2 as well. It would just cost them both their engines. By the time MiG pilots knew there was a Blackbird inbound and they scrambled their aircraft, the SR-71 was already right overhead, leaving the MiG pilots with no choice but to try to climb as fast as they could to get within range of the SR-71, and by then it was already long gone. For most other fighters that weren't capable of climbing at these rates of speed or even achieving these sorts of altitudes, the SR-71 would just zoom by overhead at 20 or even 30,000 feet higher than most fighters could reach. And to that very point, the MiG-25 actually had a higher top speed and service ceiling than the F-15 Eagle, the F-14 Tomcat, or the Swedish Viggen, which is the only foreign fighter ever to get a confirmed lock on a Blackbird. But that didn't stop American fighter pilots from managing to get their crosshairs squarely on the Habu. But in order to do that, they needed to massage the rules. And that makes this a great time to talk about how military exercises actually work. As we've discussed a number of times in the past, training exercises are very rarely organized in a way that would give the superior platform opportunity to flex all of its advantages to their fullest extent. Now, those sorts of exercises do occur, but usually in the form of platform or system testing. The rules of engagement in complex combat training exercises usually aim to level the playing field to some extent to give all the pilots and crews involved some experience working from a tactical deficit or a disadvantage. In other words, commanders intentionally set the rules to give pilots experience fighting or surviving in uncomfortable circumstances, even if the aircraft they're piloting are so capable that uncomfortable is a pretty unlikely place to find oneself. F-22 Raptor pilots, for instance, are regularly disallowed from beyond visual range engagements during training exercises against other fighters, and are sometimes even required to keep their heavy fuel drop tanks under wing when scrapping in close quarters, both conditions set by operational planners in order to nerf or diminish the Raptor's greatest combat advantages. By compromising its stealth and some degree of its maneuverability, F-22 pilots squaring off against capable fourth-generation fighters like the Eurofighter Typhoon suddenly find themselves in unfamiliar territory, fighting from a disadvantage. Of course, when the Typhoon pilots come out on top in these simulated duels, they tend to leave the Raptor's handicaps out of the story when they brag at airshows. But if you think the F-22 is often forced to fight with one wing tied behind its back, you'll be pretty shocked at the lengths SR-71 pilots would go just to make themselves a viable target for America's top-tier fighters. And when the fastest pilots in the sky got tired of losing and started breaking those training rules, not even the F-15 Eagle, the fastest fighter in American history, with an utterly unmatched modern air combat record of 104 wins and 0 losses, could come anywhere near touching the legendary Blackbird. The truth is, the McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle program might be described as an American overreaction to alarming assumptions made by the defense and intelligence communities about that aforementioned Soviet MiG-25. When the first images of this high-speed new fighter reached the Pentagon in 1967, its massive turbojet nozzles, vast wing area, and broad gulping intakes led many to believe that it was the most capable fighter ever seen to that point. In response, the US redoubled its development efforts into a new air superiority fighter, one that they hoped might be capable of standing toe-to-toe with what sure seemed to be a new Soviet juggernaut. Of course, the MiG-25 was nothing close to the high performer the US feared it to be, but American officials wouldn't find that out until 1976, when Soviet pilot Viktor Belenko defected with one, and by then, the monster they built to take it on, officially known as the F-15 Eagle, had already been in service for 8 months. And as it turns out, when you take America's massive defense expenditures and allocate it towards defeating your own imagined nightmares, the end result is an absolutely game-changing performer. But with a top speed of Mach 2.5 and a service ceiling of 65,000 feet, the mighty Eagle had its work cut out for it trying to get the Habu, which derives its name from a pit viper, into its talons, especially as a result of the SR-71's electronic countermeasures, which were so important to the aircraft's success that details about their capability are still scarce to this day. In a series of books that I'll link to in the description, former Blackbird driver and retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Richard Graham discussed his time flying high-speed sorties against the F-15 over the Nellis Air Force Base training range, not far from Area 51. Now, according to Graham, the intent of these exercises, which the pilots took to calling Eagle Bait sorties, was to give F-15 pilots practice intercepting high-altitude, fast-moving targets as only the Blackbird could simulate. And the truth is, it wasn't really a fair fight, but I'll turn it over to Graham to explain that. To maximize scarce high-altitude, high-speed intercept practice for the fighters against the SR-71, we stacked the deck in their favor to avoid a multitude of missed intercepts and consequently wasted time. Now, it should come as little surprise that the F-15 struggled with a lot of the same challenges as the MiG-25 that it was designed to beat, and one of them was certainly altitude. As we mentioned, the F-15's service ceiling is listed as 65,000 feet, but the truth is, fighter jet cockpits are not pressurized in the same way as we might expect from a commercial aircraft, and as a result, there is a great deal of risk associated with flying at high altitudes. 60,000 feet, which is 5,000 feet below the F-15's service ceiling, is generally considered to be the Armstrong limit, or Armstrong line. And it's at that altitude and higher that human blood will literally boil at our average body temperature if outside the protection of a pressurized cockpit or pressure suit. In other words, it's theoretically possible for an F-15 to fly high enough to kill its own pilot, and as you might imagine, issues with pressure become significant well before the Armstrong limit. And as Graham recounts in his book, F-15 crews with the cabin systems and flight suits available at the time were limited to being above 50,000 feet for a maximum of 90 seconds. Now, in order to achieve altitudes as high as 55,000 feet at just the right time to intercept, F-15 crews were given permission to do what's called a zoom climb. Now, a zoom climb is when your aircraft climbs in altitude using more than just the power it has available from the engines. Effectively, you do the same thing you might with a Hot Wheels track by accelerating along a horizontal or even declining trajectory to get a good head of steam and build up a great deal of speed before pulling the nose up aggressively and using all that added speed to help you climb in short order. But even that was not enough to get a lock on the Blackbird alone, though it might not be fair to blame the Eagle itself for that. Its real shortcomings came in the form of its onboard radar at the time, as well as the AIM-7 Sparrow air-to-air missiles that it had to rely on for long-range engagements. As it turned out, it was the Eagle's AN/APG-63 radar and its fire control systems that were the first to struggle, because as F-15 pilots tried to target the SR-71 from head-on, which seemed like their best bet, it turned out the speed gates on the radar fire control system, in other words, the filters set to narrow down radar returns to only legitimate threats, was set to only look for targets traveling slower than 1,500 miles per hour. And as SR-71 pilot David Peters would later recall, that just wasn't enough. I'll quote him now. "We were casually warping along at 1,850 to 2,000 miles per hour, so for them, we didn't exist." But even with that issue resolved through a software change, F-15s still struggled to find a target. So as a part of stacking the deck in the Eagle's favor, SR-71 crews were instructed to fly along a very specific flight path at altitudes no higher than 70,000 feet and at speeds no greater than Mach 2.8. They even began executing fuel dumps, leaving a massive streak of jet fuel in the sky to help F-15 pilots find them overhead. When even that proved not to be enough, Blackbirds were instructed to fly over a designated point in space called an intercept point, and even call out their approach over open radio frequencies at 1-minute intervals, starting 5 minutes out. Now, this approach, however unrealistic, gave the Eagle drivers the opportunity they needed, and they finally started racking up simulated kills against the SR-71. But the Blackbird pilots did not take too kindly to that. This time, I'll quote former Blackbird driver Captain Steve Grizenbiniak. I apologize if I mispronounced that. "After each mission, we would debrief by phone, and the F-15 drivers would report 4 AIM-7s launched, 4 kills on the Habu." Of course, Habu drivers are a competitive bunch and they're accustomed to winning, so it wasn't long before some pilots started thinking about violating the rules of engagement to put the Eagle pilots back in their place. Now, because the AIM-7 Sparrow had a semi-active radar homing guidance system, it meant the F-15 had to maintain a lock on the SR-71 all the way until the notional missile found its target. It has no onboard radar of its own, it's gotta rely on the launching aircraft's radar. And the SR-71's electronic countermeasure pod could effectively break this lock with the flip of a switch. But we're talking about imaginary missiles here, so Grizz knew that would not have the desired effect. So instead, after another round of F-15 victories, Grizz looped around for another pass, and this time did not execute a fuel dump 5 minutes out like usual. And that's largely because he was flying 16,000 feet higher than he was supposed to be, now at 86,000 feet, and a whole lot faster than before, now cruising through at Mach 3.2, and the Eagles just never had a chance. I'll quote Grizz again. In the phone debrief after the mission, the F-15 flight lead reported 4 shots and 4 kills on the first pass, and then mumbled something about radar problems and no kills on the second pass. Grizz went on to say, even with the world's best planes, pilots, and missiles, it would take a golden BB or a lucky blind shot to bring down a Habu. And while that is a great quote, I have to be honest, I think the F-14 might have something to say about it. Because while the F-15 was already a powerhouse, even with those dated onboard systems, it wasn't America's only top-tier fighter at the time. And the Navy's famed F-14 Tomcat was actually far better equipped for these sorts of intercepts. While the Eagle's AN/APG-63 radar was highly capable and would later be improved into an active electronically scanned array radar that was even more capable, it fell well short of the massive power output and multi-targeting capabilities of the Tomcat's huge AN/AWG-9 radar and fire control system. Designed to take on entire fleets of Soviet bombers at once, the AN/AWG-9 had about double the detection range of the Eagle's radar and the ability to track 24 separate targets. It could guide 6 separate missiles into 6 separate targets simultaneously. And despite being based on a fairly dated design already in the 1970s, there wouldn't be a more powerful radar installed in a fighter until the F-22 Raptor entered service. But maybe even more important than the radar was the armament, because the F-14 came equipped with the now legendary AIM-54 Phoenix missile. It was the longest ranged air-to-air missile in the world at the time, and flew with a combination of a semi-active seeker that took its cues from the F-14's radar, as well as its own active radar homing seeker for terminal guidance. In other words, once the missile was close enough to a target, the F-14 did not need to maintain a lock. It could let the missile guide itself. Training intercepts that pitted the F-14 against the Blackbird were known by insiders as Tomcat chase sorties, and they were carried out over the Pacific Ocean rather than the Nevada desert, thanks to the presence of F-14 hauling aircraft carriers at sea. Just like with the F-15 though, Habu drivers did their level best to give the Tomcats a fighting chance. They flew along straight, predetermined flight paths at lower altitudes and speeds than they normally would over hostile airspace. They also maintained open radio communications, which allowed the SR-71 pilots to guide the F-14s toward their relative positions to give them a good fighting chance. The Blackbirds flew with their transponders on and without their defensive countermeasures engaged, but even with better onboard technology and favorable conditions, they still struggled. I'll quote Blackbird pilot Dave Peters again. The F-14s could find us, but they couldn't do anything about it until we modified and gave them times, route of flight, speed, and altitude beforehand so they could have a pre-planned setup. The F-15s didn't do that well for quite some time. Tough as it was to spot the SR-71 overhead, once the Tomcats did, their Phoenix missiles posed real problems for the Habu. With a top speed in excess of Mach 4, except when put into a ballistic flight path into the ground where it could theoretically exceed Mach 5, the AIM-54 had the speed and the range it needed to close with an airborne Habu, and thanks to its onboard seeker, it would be tougher to shake than the Eagle's Sparrows. But while the F-14 is recognized today by many as perhaps the only aircraft in the world at the time with a legitimate chance at taking down an SR-71, not all Habu drivers are convinced. This time, I'll quote Graham again. Another factor in our favor was the small guidance fins on their missiles. They're optimized in size for guiding a missile to its target in the thicker air from the ground up to around 40,000 feet. At 80,000 feet, the air is so thin that full deflection of the missile's guidance fins can barely turn it. In other words, according to Graham, in the Blackbird's high-altitude domain, missiles aren't going to be nearly as good at finding their target, even in the best of circumstances. And while delving into the finer points of high-altitude aerodynamics is my idea of a good time, this video's gone on for long enough. Since no Phoenix missile was ever actually fired at an SR-71, I'll leave this debate up to you guys to hash out in the comments. Now, as I already mentioned to those of you who follow me on Twitter, in the process of putting together this story, I wrote a number of other articles about the SR-71, namely why the MiG-25 struggled so much to catch it, and why Sweden's JA-37 Viggens are the only foreign fighters ever to get a confirmed lock on the Blackbird. I also addressed claims made by a Soviet MiG-31 pilot that he scored an IR lock on a Blackbird, and a whole lot more. Those stories will all be going up on sandboxnews.com over the coming week or so for those who are interested. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. And if you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.